Good evening, and thank you for attending our Iowa History Book Club tonight. We are so glad that you're here, virtually, of course. My name is Andrew Klumpp, and I'm the editor of the Annals of Iowa here at the State Historical Society of Iowa. Every quarter, the State Historical Society hosts a book club during which we hear from authors and historians and discuss all periods and areas of Iowa's history. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at iowaculture.gov. Please remember, though, to sign up for each book club meeting you want to attend. You have to sign up for each one. Well, it's not one size fits all, but we are glad that you're here, and I hope you'll join us again in the future. Today, we are concluding our 2022 Iowa History Book Club series with Dakota in Exile by Linda Clemmons. But before we get to that, a few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. First, closed captioning is available. You can activate that through an action bar at the bottom of the screen. So if you go ahead and click the show captions, you should be able to follow along there. And we can all look forward to the Q&A session with Linda later this after the conversation that we have. Feel free, though, to type your questions into the Q&A feature throughout the evening. So anytime, if you've got one already, go ahead and put it in there. And that's going to be also in the bottom bar. My colleague, Matthew Beyer, and I will receive those when you enter them into that feature, and I'll be able to pose those to our speaker when we get to the Q&A section. Please note, though, we may not be able to get to all the questions, but we're going to do our very best to get to as many as possible. Finally, we just want to say that by participating in book club, you agree to engage respectfully with the presenter and the hosts and any of our other webinar participants. Any type of harassing or disruptive behavior, including in the chat or the Q&A feature, is prohibited. That may be, but isn't limited to, abusive or derogatory comments, threats, acts of violence, intimidation, misgendering, or just excessive comments that aren't relevant to the topic at hand. As long as you're on topic, share as much as you want, but we have to keep it on topic. All right, and with all of that out of the way, I am really pleased to introduce our guest tonight, Linda Clemmons. Linda Clemmons is the director of the Honors Program at Illinois State University. She is an expert in U.S. antebellum period and on Native Americans, and she teaches courses in those areas when she's teaching, although I know now she's more of an administrator. Her manuscript, The Conflicted Mission, which was her first book, I believe, was published by Minnesota Historical Society Press in the spring of 2014. And the book we'll be discussing tonight, Dakota in Exile, was published by the University of Iowa Press in 2019, which feels like a totally different world, as we discussed earlier before we started the book club. And this book also received the 2020 Benjamin Shambaugh Award for most significant book in Iowa history that year. So we are delighted, and Professor Clemmons has reviewed many books for us here in our journal, and she's also written an article and received a research grant for us. So she is someone who has been a part of and around the orbit of the State Historical Society for a long time. So we're really glad to welcome you here tonight. And with that, yes, without further ado, we just want to say welcome, Dr. Linda Clemmons. We are so glad to have you here tonight.
Oh, thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
Great. I know this project is one that was, as we said, you worked on a while ago. So hopefully it was a fun return to something you spent quite a bit of time with several years ago.
Yes, it was. I actually reread the book, and I'm happy to say I was happy with it. So that's always good to see things with a fresh eye.
I know as someone who does a lot of writing and editing, there's always that kind of anxiety when you go back to reading something that you've written, and it's nice when it holds up. So it doesn't always.
Yes. If I could tell a funny story about that, I was actually presenting this to my Native American history class just a few weeks ago, and I was at a PowerPoint, and I had a map on a slide. And one of my students said, "Oh, Dr. Clemmons, did you make that map yourself?" And I'm like, "Oh, no, I'm not that talented. I had someone make it." And the student's like, "Oh, good, because Wisconsin is labeled as Michigan." And I had this horrifying thought of, oh my gosh, what if that made it into the book? Sometimes you don't see the forest for the trees. And so I kind of, with trepidation, went back to the book, and it had been fixed. That Wisconsin was indeed Wisconsin. So you're absolutely right about kind of worrying, will it hold up? Will there be editorial mistakes? Will Wisconsin be Minnesota?
You never know, right? They have similar shapes sometimes, Michigan and Well, wonderful. I'm glad that it's held up, and thank you for rereading the book to come back and talk to us. I thought we'd start our conversation tonight just by asking, what sparked your interest in this topic in the first place? How did you decide to pursue writing this book?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it really stemmed from after my first book, Conflicted Mission, which examined the relationship between Protestant missionaries affiliated with the ABCFM, or American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, which was the most prominent antebellum missionary society. So my first book examined the conflicted relationship between the ABCFM missionaries and the Dakotas of Minnesota. And that book ended in 1862, right before the war. And immediately after I finished writing that book, I wanted to study what happened during and especially after the war to the Dakota Nation. There has been a lot written about the US Dakota War itself, especially military aspects of the war, but not a lot has been written about its aftermath, especially for Dakota peoples. So I really wanted to study that. And on another note, I was increasingly fascinated by biography, and I wanted to put a human face on what happened to the Dakota, both before, during, and then after the war. And a Dakota man named Robert Hopkins, that was his missionary given name, he appeared in my first book. And he was one of the few Dakota men to convert to Christianity. He lived close to the missionaries. He became a farmer. And again, I wanted to know what happened to him and his family, both during and after the war. So I actually started off wanting to write a biography about Robert Hopkins and his family, but unfortunately the information was just too fragmented. So as I started the research, I decided to use Robert Hopkins to open each chapter, to preface the story, to again, kind of put that human face on what was happening, but then tell the story of what happened to the larger Dakota Nation, but have that element of biography in it.
Mm-hmm. It's a great way to kind of like get into, and as I've worked with researchers, right, kind of one project leads to the next as you kind of pull on. Have you always been interested in the Dakota, or how did you find the Dakota? I'm curious.
Yeah, well, again, kind of our circuitous path. In graduate school, I really focused on antebellum US religion. And that led me to the ABCFM missionaries and the Dakota. So my first book really focuses, yes, on Dakota converts, but more kind of on the missionary story. And then the second book definitely it tells the story of the missionaries, but it more focuses on the story of the Dakota. So yeah, there's kind of like an evolution in terms of my interest of, right, one thing led to another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. I grew up in Northwest Iowa, where the Dakota once, I always say, that once lived in that area. We heard stories of that, often growing up, passed down from our ancestors. So it's always interesting to hear how people come to that particular group of indigenous people. That's great. I wonder, so if this is kind of how you got started, and I know you mentioned biography, was there any part of the research and writing process then that kind of surprised you? Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Oh, yeah, this is my favorite part of my job. Well, first, it's really not a surprise per se, but more of kind of a confirmation about why I love research. I see research, especially with regard to Native American history, as a puzzle, that you're putting small pieces of information together from different sources, from different disciplines, from different areas. And I love it when you find these little pieces, and as you gather more and more of these little pieces, you start to see a larger whole. And let me just give a few examples. I was at Augustana College in Rock Island, Illinois, and I was looking through some oral history transcripts, and I actually found a photograph of some of the items that the Dakota prisoners in Davenport, Iowa made. And it was just this amazing experience of reading about them and then actually seeing the artifact. As another example, in Beloit College in Wisconsin, I found a letter from Robert Hopkins requesting a scholarship for his son Samuel. So again, small little piece of information, but you put it all together and you get kind of layers of this larger story.
Yeah, that's, like, I love being a historian too for that reason, right? Because you're kind of like digging and pulling on threads and getting layers upon layers upon layers. I think that's great.
Yeah, and kind of to your original question about what surprised you, one of my main sources turned out to be newspapers from across the Midwest, but especially Iowa and then Minnesota as well. And I was just so surprised how many references there were to the Dakota in Iowa newspapers, both longer articles, but then also shorter ads. For example, I was just looking through an Iowa newspaper and I saw an ad for a county fair where Dakota prisoners were taken, and it was horse versus Indian races in Muscatine, Iowa. And they were marketed as this great family entertainment where horses would be made to race against these Dakota prisoners. And once I found that, I kept seeing these references in the newspapers. So that was a surprise to me that I didn't know how much they were chronicled in the press.
Do you think, and sorry, this isn't a question I sent you ahead of time, but you're talking about the Dakota in Iowa, and I grew up in Northwest Iowa, and so the most prominent Dakota that we heard about was Inkpaduta, who was well known for his attack in Spirit Lake. But there was, in 1957, even beyond the war, there had already been kind of a heightened awareness, at least in lots of parts of Iowa, about the Dakota as a people. Do you think that had, I know you can't know without doing research, but do you have a sense that maybe Iowans were more aware of the Dakota as a people because of that longer history, or do you have any insight?
I think so. But I also think it was a product of the US-Dakota War of 1862, and how hundreds of Dakota men were removed from Minnesota and taken to Davenport, Iowa, and held in a prison there. And a lot of my book kind of focuses on just the fascination that people in Iowa, in Davenport, and from all of the surrounding region had about these prisoners.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting, like being able to find those things. When you're doing research, especially in newspapers, to realize how much people were paying attention and curious. Mine is often, I'm an immigration historian, and so, but realizing how often they were talking about different immigrant groups during the immediate post-war period, talking about Chinese and things like that. But that's my research. I'm not here to talk about me, but newspapers can be such fascinating places because that really can surprise you, right?
Right, and that actually leads me to one of my last points of, you asked what surprised me, and that's just how much historical research has changed and continues to change. And I'm going to date myself here, from graduate school, when you use card catalogs. And if I wanted to look at letters, I needed to go to the archive in Minnesota or in Davenport, Iowa, or in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. But now things have been digitized. And like those newspapers, for example, so many of the Iowa newspapers are online and they're searchable. So once I found that little reference to the horse versus Dakota race, I could put in those keywords, and I found all of these other references. And that's something that you just could never have done with an old-fashioned reel of microfilm and a microfilm reader. And the same thing, Stephen Riggs was one of the primary ABCFM missionaries who worked with the Dakota, tried to convert them to Christianity. He wrote thousands of letters. I don't know when he slept, because he was such a copious writer. And when I first started this project, I had to go for a week or two, or however, research grants I could put together, to the Minnesota Historical Society to look at them. Now they've been digitized. And I could sit here in Bloomington, Illinois, and they're not searchable because they're handwritten, but they're digitized. And that has just really changed research over the last 20 years.
Even I noticed from when I started in graduate school to when I finished, having a phone where you can take pictures of things, like
Yes.
I would do dissertation research at times and just be scanning things with my phone over and over again, and then taking them home to process them. And that wasn't how it was when I first started,
Yeah, or an iPad.
yeah.
Mhm.
That's such a, often we spend a lot of time in book club talking about the content of the book, but I love that you're highlighting for those who are joining us and who are watching that there's something surprising even in how it is we go about doing our research. Sometimes it isn't just the content, it's the process too that can
Yeah.
be
And actually, that's what I love. I love the process and finding these kind of surprises that you wouldn't have thought of before you started.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. I'm curious now, like with all this, with the things that are surprising, I'd love to and hear a little bit more about what you think about when you're doing Indigenous history. You mentioned earlier that it's kind of interdisciplinary, right? But I'm
Mhm.
wondering, as a historian, what are some of the considerations you make when you're working with and writing histories of Indigenous people? How do you
Yeah.
go about doing that kind of work, especially because there's that fraught relationship often between Indigenous people and the US government, white settlers, and institutions?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess to kind of preface that question, I would say that my teaching informs my research and my research informs my teaching. So I really try to deal with these issues when I'm teaching, in terms of how do you study Indigenous history? How do you write it? How do you do this ethically? And I think one of the main kind of overarching themes that I like to talk about in my research, but also in my teaching, is how do you balance trauma and resistance and that story? And that's something that I really try to do in Dakota in Exile, is that this was a traumatic story. The Dakota face exile from Minnesota. They face imprisonment, death, illness, starvation. And that is a really important story that needs to be told. But within that story, Dakota men, women, and families, there's resistance too, that they find ways to survive. Like when the prisoners are imprisoned in Davenport, Iowa, they made what they call trinkets, or the Davenport people call trinkets, and they sold them to tourists. And they used that money that they made to send money to their families who were exiled in Dakota territory. They bought food for themselves. They bought paper and stamps and ink and pens so that they could write to their families. So trying to balance that story of trauma, but also survival at the same time. And I think that's sometimes very difficult to do, because you don't want to downplay the trauma by focusing too much on resistance, but there is resistance and survival within the trauma as well.
Yeah, in the reading I've done in Indigenous history, it's that balance between, I think, what you're describing. Do you find it, especially, in doing your research and writing Indigenous history, what is the process of engaging with sources, I guess? And I ask you this question a little bit because you wrote a really nice review for me a few years ago, where you were talking about the intentionality that the author of the book, which slips my mind right now, had given to the sources that she was using. And so I'm just curious about that element of navigating Indigenous history and that relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so of course, every single source has biases. And the newspapers especially, I did not take any of them as truth, if you will. They all have a point of view. They all are reporting things from a colonial perspective. So I think it's really important to take that into account when you're writing Indigenous history. If you're looking at government sources, newspapers, they're going to have a framework that they're writing in. What was really interesting about this time period is that the Dakota, because of the war, wanted to learn to read and write. They learned to read and write in the Dakota language. It was actually a language, it was translated by missionaries to proselytize. But during the war, many Dakota men, women, children learned to read and write so that they could write to family members that were separated by hundreds and hundreds of miles. So that is an amazing source. 50 of those letters have been translated by Dakota elders and they have been published. So that is certainly a source that historians can use that help to tell a different side of the story.
Yeah, I think that's, as I've worked with more and more indigenous historians, or that, like that, those biases and understanding the perspectives, all historians do that. But I think, I think many of the indigenous historians I work with speak most clearly about doing that work, which I find really important. So,
and as another point is working with Native peoples. And my book opens with the great-great-grandson of Robert Hopkins, who was named, the great-great-grandson was Robert Hopkins. And he lives presently in Montana on a reservation. And I was able to get in touch with him and talk to him about his family and to tell their story and their history. And his story, what was his story, and it gave me a new perspective. And if I could give an example, I asked him how his family remembered and talked about the US-Dakota War of 1862. And he started his answer referencing the Dawes Act of 1887. And in my kind of chronological mind, I didn't see where he was going, but luckily he told his story the way he wanted to tell it. And it turns out that in 1887, the reservation where his relatives lived, it was Assiniboine and Dakota. And his family had settled on the Assiniboine side of the reservation. And when the Dawes Act came, there was an allotment, and it was told that the Dakota were supposed to go to the Dakota side and the Assiniboine were supposed to go to the Assiniboine side. Well, they had their land. They didn't want to give it up. So he said they stopped talking about being Dakota. They had to hide that fact. So it circled around to when I asked him how they remembered, he said that they didn't, because those stories had been silenced because of the Dawes Act of 1887. So again, it was interconnected in a way that I hadn't originally seen.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I wouldn't have, because you hear like 1887 and you think, no, I meant 1862. But yeah, that's
it was connected and it was all linked together. That, I mean, my whole question was about how do you remember it, but it was what had been forgotten because they couldn't talk about it. That's trying to reclaim that story, those stories and that history.
Yeah, that's a great example. Thank you for sharing that. I think it's really important, to hear those voices. I wonder, another question I had was, what can the history of the Dakota in Iowa and the conflict between the U.S. and Dakota, teach us about Iowa history? So what can the history of the Dakota and their experience in the mid 19th century teach us about Iowa history and the broader history of the region?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one thing that kind of became clear to me as I worked through the sources was that as a collective, different regions in the Midwest viewed Native peoples differently based on their history interacting with Native peoples. So in Minnesota, during and especially after the war, there was fear and anger and calls for extermination, and money was paid for each scalp that scouts could bring in for Dakotas. Now, once the Dakota prisoners were transferred to Iowa, and once they were quote unquote defeated, that fear kind of went away, not for everyone, but in the newspapers and with journals and letters I read, in Iowa, especially in Davenport and from the surrounding area, people were fascinated by them, that they literally treated them as a tourist attraction. They wanted to go to see the Indians. So again, very different, even though the number of miles separating them was not a lot. And then interestingly, when the Dakota prisoners were released to Nebraska, again, that fear returned, that now their people who were settlers who were living in the area were worried they were going to take their lands and resources and would revert to savagery. So again, about that larger history of the region, that it really is regional, that it differs by region depending on the specific events and how they're viewing Native Americans. But I guess in all cases, Native peoples were kind of defined by stereotypes and colonialism. So they either needed to be defeated or were quote unquote defeated.
It's fascinating. I think a lot about region and just in general in my work. And so it's interesting hearing you talking too about, what we would say, well, that's the Midwest, but what you're really articulating is that, sure, it's what we now call the Midwest, but these places had very different, there were sub-regions that were very meaningful and different, and that in some ways that's also teaching something about Iowa history, because we can't just quickly assume that Iowa and Nebraska and Minnesota had the same experience in the mid-19th century, because the Dakota teach us that they were looking at things very differently.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I think underlying it was the same, as I said, defining kind of by stereotypes, but different stereotypes, if you will.
It's interesting too, entering this moment of the mid 1800s, 1860s in particular. A lot of people, even today, even people who live in Iowa, I grew up in Northwest Iowa, as I mentioned. And when you talk about, what's the big war in the 1860s, you think of the Civil War, and you don't think necessarily of the US Dakota War. So I wonder how your work on the Dakota War in the 1860s and the aftermath helps us see some of the complexities that existed in 1860s Iowa, but even in the nation, right?
Yeah. And actually, let me first just stress you're absolutely correct that I taught an honors seminar on the US Dakota War of 1862, and no one in the class had heard about it before the class. They certainly didn't know about the diaspora of the Dakota from Minnesota to Iowa, to Dakota Territory, even to Canada and beyond. And so people just don't know about that history. And I mean, of course, part of it is in the middle of the Civil War, which was, of course, momentous. But kind of to focus on the word complexity in your question, let me give kind of some examples. And again, the first one is what I just talked about, that there's not one response to the aftermath of the war and to the Dakota in Iowa or Minnesota. So like you just said, there's not one Midwest, that it is very regional and specific in terms of how they interacted with the aftermath of the war and then the Dakota people. And kind of expanding that, there's not one response among the Protestant missionaries. So I think we tend to kind of, again, lump Protestant missionaries together. And in some ways, that's true, that as Protestant missionaries, they wanted to convert and civilize, which is the word that they used, civilize all Indians. But among that, the missionaries did differ. So for example, Stephen Riggs, one of the, again, main missionaries who worked with the Dakota, he wanted to work to free some Dakota prisoners, and the some meant those who had converted to Christianity. Whereas his very close colleague, Thomas Williamson, wanted to free all Dakota prisoners, regardless of if they converted. So again, even among a group that worked for the same missionary organization, there were different ideas. And to kind of extend that further, there's not one response among the Dakota to the trauma of the war and its aftermath. For example, some Dakota worked as scouts, meaning they worked for the federal government, mainly in like the borders between Minnesota and other Midwestern states, and then into Dakota Territory. And they worked for the government as scouts, and they saw that as a way to survive. Whereas even into the present day, others Dakota say they're traitors, and it's a way that they should not have used to survive. So again, I guess kind of the complexity in terms of geography, people, native responses, there, I think it's really important as a historian to not generalize as much as possible.
Yeah, I think I would agree, perhaps unsurprisingly as a historian, but I think that's a great point. Your discussion of kind of this moment, right, in the Civil War and the complexities. I didn't send you this question ahead of time, but so it's totally okay if you don't have an answer, but I'm wondering, like, I'm thinking about the work of someone like Megan Kate Nelson, I think is her name, who writes about the Civil War West. Do you see any, is there any connection, I guess, between what's happening in the US Dakota War and what's happening in the North-South conflict, or is that really something I'm just curious, like, what are those connections?
You know what? I don't think I'm going to answer the question the way you intended.
No, that's totally fine.
But what's fascinating to me is the Dakota knew that the Civil War was happening. Mm-hmm. And they actually, I mean, they knew the news, they knew when the Union was winning, they knew especially when the Union was losing. And especially when the Union wasn't doing so well, they saw it as a good time to rebel and try to get some of their land back. So again, the idea that Native peoples were, isolated and didn't know kind of what was happening with the larger US history, it is false. And in fact, that is one of the reasons it happened in 1862, not of course the only reason, but they knew that the Civil War was going on and that the Union was focused on other things. So they thought, well, if you're focused on other things, perhaps this will be an opportunity for us to get back some of our land. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think that's what you're going for, but it made me think of kind of those links between the Civil War and indigenous history.
Yeah, no, I don't know I don't know exactly what I was going for. I just know that there are many Civil War historians or others who are starting to move to the West, and Reconstruction historians who are moving to the West.
Yeah,
and it strikes me that this is something, and I think your answer is perfect, is great. So, anyway, that's a long way of saying it's a great answer. This is my last question, and then we'll turn it over to Q&A from the audience. So if those of you who are joining, please continue to put questions in the chat. I see a few that have come in for the Q&A, and we will have plenty of time for questions. So go ahead and drop those in. This is my last question, and then we'll go into that kind of next section, which is looking back with the benefit of hindsight. Now I guess 3 years, though they feel like maybe 10, with the 3 years they've been since 2019. Is there anything that you would change about the book? Anything that you'd have included? Any new insights that might have developed since it was published?
I'm not going to say necessarily change in ideas or interpretation, but in the interim, I've been working on another project. And as I was searching for information on my third book, I did find sources that I could have and wished I would have included in my second book. So I don't think necessarily any of the new information would radically change any of my interpretation, but I think it would add more texture and more explanation. So yeah, I was, you always find those sources of, oh my gosh, why didn't I find that earlier? For example, I found another letter between Robert Hopkins and his wife, Sarah. And oh my goodness, I wish I would have been able to include that. So again, it didn't necessarily change anything, but it certainly would have added additional information.
Yeah, that's great. Well, that's probably another good thing, going back and reading and realizing that you wouldn't change anything in the book, even if you
can always make things better. But I mean, there wasn't anything that I necessarily would have retracted, for example, or anything.
Yeah, great. Well, we've got a few questions that have come in from the chat. Please feel free to put in some more. For those who haven't, we have a few that came in ahead of time too, so I'll ask those. And the first question is about contacts with Native Americans, and it's just, and you talked about this a little bit, but I'd love to hear a little bit more, and so would Marlis actually. What Native American contacts did you find helpful with the Dakota Sioux, who you're working with?
Do you mean contemporary contacts?
I think that's, yeah, like the individuals that you would work with,
Yeah.
who are still living.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I already referenced, of course, Robert Hopkins, who was the descendant of Robert Hopkins. And again, just kind of talking to him about, because of course, this is not a biography, but as I mentioned, I started each chapter with kind of a mini biography, if you will, of Robert Hopkins and his family. So to be able to talk to his descendant about their history and their memory, or how the memory of the war was taken from them, I think was just invaluable in terms of understanding not just the US Dakota War and its aftermath itself, but how it continuously affects indigenous peoples into the present day.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's actually a really nice kind of segue into another question, which is about how you use oral history from current descendants of the Dakotas, which you kind of touched on too. But I think that too, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I am not an indigenous historian, but I understand that I think indigenous history often uses current oral histories or oral traditions a bit more actively than maybe a historian of U.S. politics or something like that, right? So yeah, how did you use and engage with oral history, maybe with this project, and then I'd love to hear even more generally in your work in indigenous history.
Yeah, oh, certainly. Again, I guess I'm going to kind of go back to research informs teaching and teaching informs research. One of the first things that I do, especially with my upper division classes, is look at how indigenous history has been studied. And originally it was, very traditional in terms of what historians usually use: written sources, letters, journals, diaries. And yes, I do use those as a historian, but then with my students, we talk about how Dakota historians, indigenous historians really focus on oral history and how important it is to telling indigenous stories, and how that has been increasingly been accepted by historians, and a necessity for doing Native American history, or writing, studying, researching, writing Native American history.
And I'm curious, did you take any of those oral histories that, did you go and get new oral histories from current descendants, or work with anyone who was giving an oral history, or were these kind of already recorded ones that?
Mostly recorded, yes. Like I said, I keep talking about talking with Robert Hopkins, and I would consider that to be an oral history, but he also wrote his own history. He wrote the introduction to my book. So that is his story as a way of prefacing, what I had focused on.
Yeah, that's great. It's always interesting to hear, and that those interviews, what that looks like, how you're getting access to those oral histories, those records. I think.
Yeah, and I do assign books to, again, researching and teaching being interrelated. I do love assigning, kind of historiographical articles in terms of what sources are being used in the 60s and 70s, and what are their sources being used now. I just assigned my students a book by Julie Davis on survival schools in Minneapolis and St. Paul in the 60s and 70s, actually through the 90s and 2000. And she gathered oral histories by people who were involved in AIM and founded the survival schools. So again, I like to assign books to show students examples of how historians have used oral history in their work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's, that can be so helpful for a student, not just as a researcher, but for a student to see what using oral history looks like, and how it can be done well. I think it's terrific. I have another question here that is kind of a question that says, concerns about corruption, possibly reducing supplies for the Dakota, just in general, not clear when. And I'm wondering how, the question is, how do you document research into corruption? And I'm not sure if this is, at what level this is, but the reduction of supplies, maybe, how do you document something like that reduction of supplies 150 years after something took place? How do you account for that?
Okay, I think there are kind of different ways to take that. So I'm going to give the example of supplies to the prisoners who were held in Davenport, Iowa. So they were held, it was a Civil War recruiting camp in Davenport, Iowa. And part of it was repurposed as a prison for the Dakota prisoners after the war. And there were problems with supplies to the Dakota prisoners in that they were lacking. They didn't have medicine, they didn't have a doctor, they didn't have enough food to eat. And in terms of, I think the question was a source one, how do you document that? The prison commander of the prison himself said that that the Dakotas were going to be given enough just to survive because of punishment for what they had done in Minnesota. And then you can actually look at, I went to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and you can look at the requisitions of what supplies they were given. So you can kind of correlate what was being said with an actual list of supplies. And then you can also look at, they have records of how many prisoners unfortunately died in prison. Many of them were smallpox, consumption, and you can document kind of the lack of medical care and medicine as well. So I think that is actually a question that has a lot of written documents that you can trace in terms of letters, diaries, journals, military requisitions of food and medicine and things like that.
Great. I hope that answers the question. It certainly is informative. I think it gets close to what we were going for. Another question comes, and this is, the question is if you offer any Native American history or Native American history courses online, presumably for others. So I'll say, do you offer those? But are you aware of anything else for someone who maybe wants to know more about Native American history or find a class that they could take?
Oh gosh, I do not offer anything online, except of course during COVID where we were all forced to teach online. I do not, I am sure. One of the things when I was teaching my when I was teaching my exploration on my honors exploration on the US Dakota War of 1862 is I started out showing a documentary about present day Dakota, and they reenacted the movement from the Dakota, from South Dakota to Mankato. And it's a really powerful documentary. I'm forgetting the title now, of course, when put under pressure. There's also some fabulous podcasts on NPR about the US Dakota War of 1862. So I'm not sure of online classes, but I know there's a lot of kind of digital media that that cover this topic that might be something that would be interesting to look into. And given some time, I could get the name of the documentary, but it's leaving my brain right now.
If you think of it, just shoot it to me and we can include it in a follow-up email that we'll send on Monday. And then I'll also say too, for this question, we have a lot of, maybe not specific to the US Dakota War, the Historical Society, but we have some wonderful presentations, one about Ink Paduta, who is a well-known Dakota here in Iowa that was presented a few years ago, one about indigenous resistance to settler colonialism in Iowa, which focused on an earlier period, 1830s, and Black Hawk, that era. And then we have a number of primary source sets and some articles. If you are getting emails for this, you will get the follow-up email likely on Monday that will include a bunch of links. Not a class, but we have some digital resources here at the Historical Society. So feel free to dive into those as they come. So sorry to take the microphone, but
oh no, thank you. I appreciate that.
Help connect people to things that they're interested in. This is a great question. So this person says, being from Sibley, Iowa, and I want to say a shout out to the person from Sibley. I'm from Sanborn, which is just down the road. She's curious about the way that General Sibley is remembered today. She says, I know there are places in Minnesota named after him, and the Minnesota Historical Society has a Sibley historic site. That makes him sound like a hero, but what is the Dakota view, and how would you add a Dakota perspective to the Sibley Historic site?
Oh, absolutely. What a wonderful question. And absolutely, that goes to perspective and remembrance, and how different people remember things very, very differently. And absolutely, Sibley as, perhaps a military hero versus Dakota memories of Sibley are quite different. And let me give you an example. So after the war ended in 1862, Sibley created what was called Camp Release. And it was supposed to be a place where Dakota non-combatants, so those who had not been involved in the war, and especially Dakota elders, children, families, women, could go and be safe. And then it turns out increasingly he thought and he promised them protection. And over time, he decided that most of them were probably guilty, and ended up there were trials, and many of the men were imprisoned in Mankato. 38 were eventually hanged in the largest mass execution in US history. And then the women, children, and elders were sent to, about 1,600 of them were sent to a prison camp in Fort Snelling. So that is an absolutely very good question in terms of getting at how different remembrances are based on who's doing the remembering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And helps keep in mind, that difference in how people remember. It's really important to understand where they're situated.
Right. And I mean, certainly even today in Minnesota, you have descendants of settlers who remember the war in very different ways from descendants of the Dakota 38, for example, who were executed in Mankato.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think that, in my experience too, as someone who grew up in an area with history of indigenous people, there's whose family was around at the time, there are the memories of of those who settled, and the memory of the indigenous people, and they aren't always easy to square, and that can be difficult, but also it's okay that it's hard. So that's great. Another question, and we do have time for a few more if folks have more questions. I've got some that were sent in ahead of time too, but this is kind of a last call, if you will, if you want to get your questions in, because we've got about 10 minutes left. So a question that came up is just asking what source you were using when you were getting into the online newspapers from Davenport. How did you get into those? I know we have some here at the Historical Society, but I wonder what you used.
I'm not going to lie, I use newspapers.com. It is a wonderful online source. I believe it's by subscription, and they have hundreds and hundreds of newspapers, but they don't have everything. So a lot of state historical societies also have digitized newspapers and are continuing to digitize newspapers. For example, and I think, when I was talking earlier about how history has really changed in terms of the sources that are available, I think it's to a certain extent gone too much in the other direction. That I was in Minnesota, and I was talking to one of the librarians, and I'm like, oh, I just can't find this information. And I just assumed that all of their newspapers had been digitized. And she's like, oh, no. We could digitize 24/7 every single day of the year and would not have made barely a dent in what's available, because there are so many local newspapers in the 19th century. So I tend to think, oh, if it's not digitized, it's not there. But that's not necessarily the case. That it still is sometimes useful to go to this Iowa State Historical Society and see, talk to a librarian who knows what's available and what's not available. That digitized newspapers are, there's more and more every single day, but they're not entirely online yet.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my closest colleagues runs our digital newspaper project here in Des Moines, or in the State Historical Society, and I know that she's always working to get more online, but it takes time. I am going to drop a link in the chat for everyone that will take you to our website that has a variety of links that'll take you to newspapers.com, but also to some other digital repositories of Iowa newspapers that you can get access to at the Historical Society. You can also, if you ever visit us here in Des Moines or in Iowa City at our research centers, you have even more access to digitized newspapers and all the microfilm and things like that. Like Professor Clemmons was saying, a lot of times we even have things on microfilm, so they're here, but they haven't been digitized, so they're easily accessible. And some of those we can even interlibrary loan to your local library, the microfilm. So if there's something that you want, and you know that we have it, and we probably do have it, even if it's not digitized, but you can't make it to Des Moines or Iowa City, you probably could work with your local library to get it interlibrary loaned to you. So my colleagues would love it if I make that plug for them. So yes, there's all those. It's both and so much digitized, but also come and see us or ask for those records. So I don't know if you have anything else to add, but that was another.
No,
great.
thank you.
And there's another source that one of the participants put into the Q&A. So if you're following along and you see the answered questions, I'll make that available to theirs. So this is another question. Are these so there's a question about the Dakota. Are these the same Dakota who would have attacked Black Hawks families as they were fleeing to Wisconsin, or killed them as they were attempting to cross the Mississippi to avoid during the Black Hawk War? So maybe who, this is earlier than your research, and I know that, but how would this group of a Dakota that you've studied been related to maybe some of the other indigenous people from Eastern Iowa who would have been moving into places where they used to live?
So the Dakota, I don't know if I want to use the word cousin, but I'm going to use it. So the Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota are all related. So the Lakota over time were more Dakota Territory, Black Hills. The Nakota were more kind of Nebraska, Iowa, and the Dakota were in Minnesota. And when I say cousins, they all could understand each other's language, but there were slight differences. So for example, the Dakota would say Coda for friend. In Nakota, it's Kona, and in Lakota, it's Kola. So they're all related. They did go on hunts together, but they did have kind of their own geographic regions. So the Dakota of the books that I've written were mainly located in Minnesota, although they certainly could and did hunt into Dakota Territory or down into Iowa or into other regions as well. But they all did have kind of their distinct regions as well.
Mm-hmm. So these wouldn't necessarily have been the ones that were coming into contact with the all the way down kind of near Saginaw or where Black Hawk was, right? Is that?
I probably should know more about the Black Hawk War than I do, so I'm not going to comment on something that I don't know a lot about. I have assigned Black Hawk's biography before, but I haven't read it, or autobiography, excuse me. I haven't read it in quite some time. So
Okay. No, that's totally fine. And we do have this will be something that's included in the follow-up email that'll go out next week too. Is that the article about indigenous resistance to settler colonialism does talk about some of the different indigenous alliances, if you will,
yes.
with the difference between the Sauk and the Meskwaki, and the Dakota didn't always get along, but sometimes it depended on who was talking to whom, that kind of thing. So we have a few sources we'll share too that might give.
And certainly there's historians right now working on kind of those borderlands in terms of like Ojibwe and Dakota. So that is certainly an area of study right now. That historians are working on.
Yeah, great. So so what I hear is keep looking. Oh, this is a really helpful question too, maybe, which is about the Sioux, the name Sioux, and how that relates to the Dakota. Could you, for our listeners, because it does say the Sioux didn't get along with the Sauk and the Meskwaki, who are very prominent in Iowa history, but could you talk about the Sioux as a name and what that means as it relates to the Dakota and the Dakota and others?
Absolutely. So the Dakota name translates into friend or ally. So when the French explorers and were first kind of coming down from Canada into the Minnesota region, they encountered the Ojibwe. And as the story goes, they asked the Ojibwe, well, what's the name of the people who are living right below you? And the Ojibwe said, and I'm probably not going to pronounce this right, but it was Noatisu, which meant enemy or adder, because at times the Ojibwe and Dakota were enemies. So the French didn't quite understand the Ojibwe word, so they shortened it to Sioux. So actually, Sioux is derived from a derogatory term that means enemy or adder, whereas Dakota, which they called themselves, meant friend or ally. So it is Sioux is actually has a colonial origin in the French not kind of understanding the name of the people they encountered.
And am I right that Sioux often, at least in how it's used today, refers to a much larger group of people and a language group, whereas the Dakota is more specific, right? Is that right?
Yes, the Sioux now collectively, again, refers to the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and other divisions within there. So yes, it's a colonial misnomer, but it's also been adopted over the years. Like if you're driving through South Dakota, you'll see, Sioux Nation. So, but its origin is from kind of that colonial misunderstanding and colonialism.
That's always helpful to hear and understand, because a lot of it is a distinction that sometimes can be lost, but also that needs to be made. So I'm going to take the chair's prerogative because we have 2 minutes left. I think we've gotten through many of, if not all, the questions that have come in tonight, which was important. So in the last couple minutes, I just wondered if you could talk to us. You've got this great project, and we talked a little bit earlier about how one project leads to the next, and now you've done this wonderful book, which we've enjoyed hearing all about tonight. And I wonder what is next. What are you working? What are you working on? Where has that last project led you to your current one?
Yeah. No, again, one thing leads to another. So remember, I said I was fascinated by biography and couldn't really find enough about Robert Hopkins and his family to write a biography. Well, my next book is actually a biography. It is about a mixed ancestry Dakota woman named Angelique Renville, who lived through the time period that I focused on in both of my books. And she was adopted, which was the word the missionaries used. She was adopted by the Riggs family and lived with them for 10 years. So she learned to speak English, to read and write. They even sent her to a female seminary in Ohio for a year. And to make a long story short, she ended up renouncing the missionaries and going to Dakota Territory with her Dakota husband. The missionaries were very, very upset with her. And she actually ended up hiring a lawyer and suing for the return of her lands. So she used her knowledge of English and of literacy to hire a lawyer to attempt to sue both the missionaries and others to get her land back that had been used to fund her studies in Ohio. So, and we've talked a lot about sources. Because she was literate and because she could speak English, I have probably 15 letters that she wrote at various points of her life, like from the seminary in Ohio, talking about how unhappy she was. I have a letter hiring the lawyer. So just a really interesting story, but also some interesting sources too.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And you said it's that is well along the path, right? You know, to being out maybe sometime for us to read, right?
Hopefully, yes.
not the kernel of a project, but a really well formed one that's well on its way. That's great.
Yes,
Well, thank you so much. With that, though, I'm looking at my clock and it's 8 o'clock. So with that, I think that's all the time we have for book club tonight. I think we can all agree that this has just been a really informative and enjoyable conversation. So I want to thank everyone who's joined us this evening, but a big thank you to Linda Clemmons for making the time to be here. You know, I always love it when I have a chance to talk to people whose work I admire, and yours is someone whose work I've read years ago, and it's been great too, and more recently, of course, too, right, for this. But I just have really enjoyed our conversation. I want to thank you for taking the time to be with us and join us here tonight. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, we hope that everyone who's here tonight will sign up for our next book club. That's going to be in March. I promised it to be a really fascinating conversation. We'll be talking about Midwestern history more broadly with John Lauk as we discuss his brand new book, The Good Country, which is out last month with the University of Oklahoma Press. Look for registration announcements and our full 2023 book club schedule in the new year. So that isn't out yet. You can't quite register yet, but because you're here, I'm letting you know that we've got good stuff planned for next year. For more information or to register for future webinars in this series, do check out our website, iowaculture.gov. While you're there, you can look at some of our other fantastic digital programs, such as the Goldie's Kids Club activities for young historians. Watch recordings of the Iowa 101 series, which is hosted by our team here in Des Moines, or the Iowa Stories series, which is hosted by our Iowa City branch. Both of those have a lot of Indigenous history, so do check those out. You can also subscribe to the Annals, of course, something that's close to my heart, for more research and writing and reviews on Iowa history. And with that, I will just thank you all for joining us tonight and say have a great evening. Take care.
Thank you.